All right. Next week, we're going to be going back to the 19th century. So we'll be reading Benjamin on Baudelaire. So the main reading, be prepared for, is The Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire, which is a lengthy essay. It's almost 100 pages long. The second reading is Paris, the Capital of the 19th Century. Actually, there are two versions, Paris the Capital and Paris Capital. So there's one from 1935 and there's one from 1939. We'll concentrate on the one from 1935. You'll see that there are some other readings available. The other primary readings that we'll have are from Baudelaire, the two art criticism selections from the Salon of 1846 and from 1855. And Benjamin will be quoting a great deal from his poetry, so I've given some selections so you guys can read things in their entirety. And then there's also Marx, the 18th Brumaire, which Benjamin will cite, as well as we'll look at one part of the chapter 1 of volume 1 of Das Kapital, the fetishism of commodities. We'll just look at one section of that to in particular. Adorno also has, like he did for this week, a letter feedback to Benjamin criticizing what he had written when it was just a draft. We'll do 2 more weeks because today we're discussing Benjamin. We'll do 2 further weeks on Benjamin, the Arcades Project, and then another part of the Arcades Project, which is his piece on the concept of history, which was his draft introduction to the Arcades Project, from which the Baudelaire writings are taken. And this will set us up for the postmodernism that will be the final section of the course. So anyone interested in presenting next time on Benjamin on Baudelaire? Okay. Benjamin on Baudelaire. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, good. All right, so let's start to get into it. So 2 readings for this week. The author is producer in The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction is probably most likely the thing by Benjamin you will have read previously as an undergrad. It's the most widely read piece by Benjamin. It's a little bit atypical for him, though. Benjamin, for the most part, wrote literary criticism. He wrote on literature. He was a literary critic and also literary historian. Also a translator. He translated Proust from French into German, as well as Baudelaire from French into German. So his main area of dedication in his writing was on literature rather than on visual art. The reason that the work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction has become canonized in the way that it has, and we'll see Adorno anticipates this to a certain degree, is that it's been taken up as a kind of justification or legitimation of mass cultural forms, photography and cinema, 20th century popular cultural forms. Recall the first week of class we read Susan Buck-Morse on her response to the visual culture questionnaire, where she set up the distinction between art and culture and warned that a kind of cultural studies approach threatened to liquidate art as we have known it. That's the way she put it. And of course, Benjamin's work of art essay was part of that turn to cultural studies starting in the 70s, in the 1970s. A certain kind of reception. So generally, Krakauer, who we read, and Benjamin are seen as positive regarding popular culture, and Adorno is seen as negative when it comes to popular culture. Of course, neither of those perspectives are accurate, because Adorno and Krakauer and Benjamin are all, at least in the readings that we've done from Krakauer, dialectical in their approach to the mass cultural forms of the 20th century, meaning it's not a matter of affirmation or condemnation. It's not a matter of celebrating or bemoaning. It's rather a matter of dealing with the actual present phenomena that are emerging. So again, Susan Buck-Morse in that first week's reading, she said, we don't need a discourse of legitimating culture. We don't need a discourse of legitimating culture, but that's what we've gotten. That's what we've gotten. Rather, she thought we need a critical approach to culture and to art. And popular culture, so-called, is actually popular art. Something that we started to get into and we're coming back around to. Namely, one of the ways of thinking about mass culture or mass art would be a better way of thinking about it, is that the work is still produced at an artisanal level. Work is still produced by individuals or small groups of people. But what has changed is mass distribution forms. So produced at an individual or small group, still, like studio, individual production, small scale production, artisanal production, but industrial distribution, industrial conditions of consumption of work. And then, of course, those things start to affect each other, meaning, of course, the mass distribution, or as Benjamin's going to address it, mass reproduction techniques, technology, we would call it, then affect the original work, meaning the original work is then produced to be mass distributed. But still, the genres are the bourgeois genres. So we have bourgeois art, but a mass public. So we have art produced as a commodity, but as a commodity in the industrial era, which means actually there's a little bit of a question about the commodity character of art, of literature. Meaning it's not simply a matter of a market for the artwork. It's a matter of the mass society that consumes the artwork. Right? So we've encountered this in Adorno's writings on music, that it's not a matter of people liking things, sort of making choices on the market, but rather it's about familiarization with things that are foisted upon us. So, we have this stuff thrown at us through mass industrial distribution techniques, and then we sort of adjust ourselves to what's on offer. Right? And that's an active process. It's not a passive thing. And even though we are overwhelmed by the power of capitalist distribution of cultural goods, cultural commodities, that doesn't mean that our experience of the artwork is nonetheless, it is still an active subject that's consuming, an active viewer, an active listener, an active reader that is consuming. So the question is, how does this mass context for art affect it? Does it affect it? How does it affect it? So generally, we've been talking about capitalism as a function, going back to the Wilhelm Reich. So for Marx, or Marxism, capitalism is defined not by the market or by profit seeking. That's not the way Marxists define capitalism. It's rather the contradiction. It's defined by the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. A related way of thinking about this contradiction is the contradiction between the ideological superstructure and the socioeconomic base. And that this is a temporal contradiction. Meaning we have an 18th century set of social relations, and we have an 18th century ideological superstructure. We have a bourgeois superstructure and a bourgeois consciousness. That would be another way of thinking about it. Consciousness. We have bourgeois consciousness. And consciousness is not just what we think, it's what we do. So consciousness is both a matter of theory and practice. But we have a 19th century industrial forces of production and 19th century socioeconomic base. So we have two realities. We have an 18th century reality, the reality of the values of the American and French revolutions, based on the social relations of labor, Protestant work ethic, rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all equal in those inalienable rights. Liberty, equality, and fraternity in terms of the French Revolution. That's something that we'll talk about more next week when we get into the Arcades project. The values of the French Revolution, more clearly even, articulated, namely the revolt of the Third Estate, based on the values of work. The Third Estate works, the First Estate prays, the Second Estate fights, the nobility, the aristocracy, the warrior caste. The Third Estate works. So it's about the emancipation of labor, it's the emancipation of the social relations of labor, but that emancipation is contradicted by the Industrial Revolution. So we have the rights that we have that are the inalienable rights of this society are the inalienable rights of labor. But those are contradicted by the industrial forces of production in the socioeconomic base. Okay, so again, production and consumption is another way that this might show up. It show up as a contradiction between production and consumption. So let's think about that for a second. Again, Susan Buck-Morse helped us out. Artists' work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience, making it available to others, making what was previously only dimly perceived, now consciously experienced. So the fact that there might be a contradiction between production and consumption. Last week in reading from Clement Greenberg and also reading about Clement Greenberg, he posed the question of art going into crisis when the artist or the literary writer, it can't be sure of the effects on the audience, on the reader. Right? That the assumed forms can't be taken for granted in terms of their effects, in terms of the aesthetic effects, the literary effects. Right? And so that produces this crisis of the avant-garde and the kitsch. Two sides of modernism, a way of describing the self-contradiction in modernism between the attempt to be historically current, superior consciousness of history, be in the vanguard of modernity, versus bringing up the rear guard of modernity, which is the kitsch. So kitsch sort of avoids this problem. by pretending to be popular, pretending to meet the audience exactly where they are. However, again, still, the kitsch art can't be certain of its effects either. It can flood the market. That's what it can do. Now, why I'm saying all of that, effects, what Greenberg meant by effects and what T.J. Clark and Michael Fried discussed last week, recall what T.J. Clark described in terms of modernism, a bourgeois art without a bourgeois public. So bourgeois production without being able to assume bourgeois consumption. So at the level of what's meant by the public, or what's meant by effects, the experiential content of art, the experience of art, crisis of experience, which we read about in Experience in Poverty by Benjamin. So we have to keep all these things in mind. We have our V12 engine. We're driving our Lamborghini down the historical highway. All the pistons are firing now, right, to get us to the point where we can begin to read the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction without banalizing it and turning it into, oh, he thinks film is great and he thinks painting's outmoded or something, which is the way it's usually taught. You know, as a film studies student, when I was here at the Art Institute, I was in the video department, and it was literally like Adorno, popular culture bad, Benjamin, popular culture good, because Adorno is for bourgeois art, but Benjamin is somehow for proletarian art. No, film is not proletarian art. It's still bourgeois art. It's still bourgeois art. Okay, so crisis of experience, self-contradiction of experience. But we have two kinds of experiences going on simultaneously. We have bourgeois experience. We have the experience of the bourgeois subject, the subject of bourgeois social relations, the subject of bourgeois society, the worker, the laborer, the self-produced person, the free individual. We have that experience, but we also have the experience, the proletarian experience, of being a member of industrial mass society. And those are in contradiction with each other. Okay. I'm going to look at just the first epigraph of and the first intro part of the work of art essay, and then we'll go back to the author as producer. But I want to set it up with Benjamin's epigraph from Paul Valéry, who's a poet as well as an art critic. So like others like Baudelaire and Mallarmé and Proust, these are writers who also do literary criticism and visual art criticism. Valéry is one. Let's see what Valéry has to say. He writes, "Our fine arts were developed, their types and uses were established in times very different from the present, by men whose power of action upon things was insignificant in comparison with ours. But the amazing growth of our techniques, the adaptability and precision they have attained, the ideas and habits they are creating, make it a certainty that profound changes are impending in the ancient craft of the beautiful. In all the arts, there is a physical component which can no longer be considered or treated as it used to be, which cannot remain unaffected by our modern knowledge and power. For the last 20 years, neither matter nor space nor time have been what it was from time immemorial. We must expect great innovations to transform the entire technique of the arts, thereby affecting artistic invention itself and perhaps even bringing about an amazing change in our very notion of art. Neither matter nor space nor time, nor energy, just to round it out, matter and energy, space and time, none of these things are what they used to be. in comparison to people of the Renaissance or people of the 18th century. Certainly people in traditional civilization, our power over things is in a whole other level than it was for those people. And yet, they developed the forms of art that we have now. It's a mismatch. So we read To the Planetarium by Benjamin. Did we read that or did we not read that? I'm trying to recall whether we encountered To the Planetarium. Let me look on our syllabus. It might be something that we're going to read next week. I thought we might have. I don't remember now, though. In the Marx week, I think. Maybe not. Here, let me see. Did we look at this one? We did. Okay, great. Excellent. Okay. And he means this very literally, and we should understand it quite literally. So Valery is writing around the turn of the 20th century. So quantum mechanics and the theory of relativity were being formulated at this time. Newtonian space and time were being burst. So let's stick with space and time for a second. We'll come back to it with the aura. Kant said, any notion of experience has to be based on concepts of space and time. So humans or intelligent beings, because in the 18th century and the 1700s, they were like, there might be other intelligent beings. They were already thinking about extraterrestrials. There might be other intelligent beings. Any intelligent being would have to have a notion of space and a notion of time. However, a notion of space, a notion of time, but those are variable, meaning across history and across cultures, actually our experience of space and time have changed. It's historically variable. So we do not, the animals do, we do not have an experience of space and time based on our biological processes. Right? Because our biological processes give us a sense of space and a sense of time, but that is affected by our social processes, our social relations. And we're going to see this category technology, technology. There are three terms in German that are to be distinguished here. Of course, Valerie is French, but I think it still bears. The Germans are very Greek-oriented. So we got techne, which is a Greek word, techne. Then they got technics. Which we would call technique. And then they've got technology, which we have technology. They don't mean the same thing. So techne is any kind of like practical activity. It's like a kind of a form of praxis. Technique, that would refer to like a medium or like a formal genre. And then technology or technology is what we do with that, and how we use it. So we in English conflate technique and technology, right? So we treat this as a piece of technology. It would rather be a piece of techniques, and then what we do with it would be technology. And by what I mean by what we do with it, meaning not just individually but collectively, how we utilize it, would be technology. That's going to be important. Okay. So we have already, I think, addressed this with respect to Marxism. Technology is a social relation. It's an alienated social relation. or at least it's an externalized social relation. So again, into the planetarium, he says, technology is not about mastering nature, but it's about mastering our relation to nature. In the same way that education is not about mastering children, but mastering the relation between generations. Right, so we call it social relations, or relations to others, relations between people, but also relations to nature, and relations to ourselves. And nature being everything that exists, so not restricted to physical and biological nature, but everything that has come into existence, everything historically produced, everything that exists. So technology becomes a way that we relate to others, we relate to nature, and we relate to ourselves. So technology is a social relation. It's a form of mediating our social relation. Because the industrial forces of production, however, have not been mastered, again to use the language of the planetarium, because we have not mastered the industrial forces of production, the bridal bed has become a bloodbath, and the frenzy of destruction has not become the ecstasy of procreation. And World War I was the signal event that demonstrated how we had not, as a society, mastered the industrial forces of production that have been let loose. Marx in the Communist Manifesto says capitalism has let loose the forces of production, like the sorcerer's apprentice has let loose the forces of magic and not been able to control them. Okay. Here's Benjamin. When Marx undertook his critique meaning exploration of conditions of possibility for transformation, not criticism, not debunking, not opposition. When Marx undertook his critique of the capitalistic mode of production, this mode was in its infancy, meaning, again, capitalism began after the Industrial Revolution, began in the early 19th century, and Marx was there at the beginning. Marx directed his efforts in such a way as to give them prognostic value. So recall that the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena are treated as, so the capitalist mode of production, its phenomena are treated as symptomatic, that are also diagnostic, but most importantly, they're prognostic. They point beyond themselves. He went back to the basic conditions underlying capitalistic production, and through his presentation showed what could be expected of capitalism in the future. The result was that one could expect it not only to exploit the proletariat with increasing intensity, but ultimately to create conditions which would make it possible to abolish capitalism itself. So the prognosis of capitalism is that it will abolish itself. That's put in totally alienated terms. It, itself, it. So notice it exploits the proletariat. It's not that the capitalists exploit the proletariat. It's capitalism that exploits the proletariat. The transformation of the superstructure, ideological superstructure, which takes place far more slowly than that of the substructure, or the base, has taken more than half a century to manifest in all the areas of culture the change in the conditions of production. So again, our theory and practice lags behind our historical conditions, which outstrip them. Only today can it be indicated what form this has taken. Certain prognostic requirements should be met by these statements. However, theses about the art of the proletariat after its assumption of power, or about the art of a classless society, would have less bearing on these demands than theses about the developmental tendencies of art under present conditions of production. They're dialectic, because after all, the conditions of production are contradictory between the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production. Their dialectic is no less noticeable in the superstructure than in the economy. It would therefore be wrong to underestimate the value of such theses as a weapon. dialectical weapon. They brush aside a number of outmoded concepts such as creativity and genius, eternal value and mystery, concepts whose uncontrolled and at present almost uncontrollable application would lead to a processing of data in the fascist sense. And we'll see what he means by that. The concepts which are introduced into the theory of art, in what follows, differ from the more familiar terms in that they are completely useless for the purposes of fascism. They are, on the other hand, useful for the formulation of revolutionary demands in the politics of art. Okay, that's his preface. Now let's look at his epilogue, again, just to frame his point. And again, this should all recall that to the planetarium aphorism that we read. The growing proletarianization of modern man and the increasing formation of masses are two aspects of the same process. Fascism attempts to organize the newly created proletarian masses without affecting the property structure which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while preserving property. So the social relations are to be preserved, but we can express ourselves politically through fascism. The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life. Why? Because they're expressive. The violation of the masses, whom fascism with its Führer cult forces to their knees, has its counterpart in the violation of an apparatus which is pressed into the production of ritual values. And again, this is one of the main categories that he has in the essay: cult value or ritual value versus exhibition value. We'll come back to that. All efforts to render politics aesthetic culminate in one thing: war. War and war only can set a goal for mass movements on the largest scale while respecting the traditional property system. This is the political formula for the situation. The technological formula may be stated as follows. Only war makes it possible to mobilize all of today's technical resources while maintaining the property system. It goes without saying that the fascist apotheosis of war does not employ such arguments. Still, Marinetti, he's the founder of Futurism, says in his manifesto on the Ethiopian colonial war, "For 27 years, we futurists have rebelled against the branding of war as anti-aesthetic. Accordingly, we state war is beautiful because it establishes man's dominion over the subjugated machinery by means of gas masks, terrifying megaphones, flamethrowers, and small tanks. War is beautiful because it initiates the dreamt-of metallization of the human body. War is beautiful because it enriches a flowering meadow with the fiery orchids of machine guns. War is beautiful because it combines the gunfire, the cannonades, the ceasefire, the scents, and the stench of putrefaction into a symphony. War is beautiful because it creates new architecture like that of the big tanks, the geometrical formation flights, the smoke spirals from burning villages, and many others. Poets and artists of futurism remember these principles of an aesthetics of war so that your struggle for a new literature and a new graphic art may be illumined by them." This manifesto has the virtue of clarity, Benjamin writes. Its formulations deserve to be accepted by dialecticians, meaning this is a legitimate articulation of the real situation. To the latter, to dialecticians, the aesthetics of today's war appears as follows. If the natural utilization of productive forces is impeded by the property system, the increase in technical devices, in speed, and in the sources of energy will press for an unnatural utilization, and this is found in war. Unnatural here, what a strange formulation. What he means by that is not appropriate to the historical situation. Why? Because what would be appropriate to the historical situation is communism. It's overthrowing capitalism. Unnatural utilization found in war. The destructiveness of war furnishes proof that society has not been mature enough to incorporate technology as its organ, that technology has not been sufficiently developed to cope with the elemental forms of society, or forces of society. The horrible features of imperialistic warfare are attributable to the discrepancy between the tremendous means of production and their inadequate utilization in the process of production. In other words, to unemployment and the lack of markets. Imperialistic war is a rebellion of technology which collects in the form of human material the claims to which society has denied its natural material, again, the historically produced material. Instead of draining rivers, society directs a human stream into a bed of trenches. Instead of dropping seeds from airplanes, it drops incendiary bombs over cities. And through gas warfare, the aura is abolished in a new way. What art makes, there goes the world, says fascism. And as Marinetti admits, expects war to supply the artistic gratification of a sense perception that has been changed by technology. This is evidently the consummation of art for art's sake. It's also the consummation of production for production's sake. So production for the sake of production in capitalism is alienated, becomes production for capital, and this is the result. That would also be in the domain of art. Art for the sake of art becomes art for the sake of capital. It's an alienated form of the same. Mankind, which in Homer's time was an object of contemplation for the Olympian gods, now is one for itself. Its self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. This is the situation of politics which fascism is rendering aesthetic. Communism responds by politicizing art. Okay, so politicizing art, what the hell does that mean? Because that's really the difficulty. And that's what we read the author as producer to help us out with, what it means to politicize art. So politicizing art doesn't mean using art to separate groups of people. It's not about some kind of political polarization of people over art. No. It's also not about factionalizing art. It's not about factionalizing people, nor is it about factionalizing art. So, again, the dialectical reversal of aestheticizing politics, politicizing aesthetics. So what does that mean? Let's look at that. The author is producer. So this is written a couple of years before the work of art essay, and that's why we can trust that it's the same idea that he has in mind. Because it's, again, when we think of politicizing art, we have really fascistic 20th century phenomena in mind. We have the political powers favoring one style of art over other styles and repressing the other styles that it doesn't approve of. So that went on in the Soviet Union as well as in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. The art that was not the approved style was forcibly suppressed. Now in liberal democracy, we have some of that. We do have some of that, but generally what we have is the operation of the market to the same effect. Okay, the author is producer. He quotes Ramon Fernandez, "The task is to win over the intellectuals to the working class by making them aware of the identity of their spiritual enterprises and of their condition as producers." Okay, and here's Benjamin. "You will remember how Plato deals with poets in his ideal state. He banishes them from it in the public interest." So that's not just poets in the sense of literary artists, but all art. All art is banished from the ideal republic in Plato. We talked about this with the fetish character in music and the regression of listening, about how Plato only allowed one kind of music to remain, and that was marching music. Right? That's because it was a republic for war. It was an ancient republic, it's a republic for war. Plato had a high conception of the power of poetry. That's why it had to be banished. But he believed it harmful and superfluous, in a perfect community, of course. The question of the poet's right to exist, or the artist's right to exist, has not often since then been posed with the same emphasis, but today it poses itself. So, art's right to exist. The artist's right to exist. Art's right to exist. Probably it is only seldom posed in this form, but it is more or less familiar to you all as the question of the autonomy of the poet, or the autonomy of art. So the self-determination, self-rule of art. Of his freedom to write whatever he pleases, freedom to make whatever he pleases. He says to his audience at the Institute for the Study of Fascism, leftists, communists, you are not disposed to grant him this autonomy. You believe that the present social situation compels the writer or the artist, to decide in whose service he is to place his activity. Which side are you on, comrades? Which side are you on? The bourgeois writer of entertainment literature does not acknowledge this choice. You must prove to him that without admitting it, he is working in the service of certain class interests. A more advanced type of writer does recognize this choice. His decision made on the basis of class struggle is to side with the proletariat. This puts an end to his autonomy. His activity is now decided by what is useful to the proletariat in the class struggle. Such writing is commonly called tendentious. This is where he's introducing the dialectic that he wants to explore. Tendency versus quality. Tendency versus quality. Political tendency versus aesthetic quality. Here, you have the catchword around which has long circled a debate familiar to you. Its familiarity tells you how unfruitful it has been. So, in other words, any long-standing debate, by fact of being long-standing, tells you how useless it is. So if we're still having the same arguments about things as 20 or 40 years ago, that's because the terms are useless. For it has not advanced beyond the monotonous reiteration of arguments for and against. On the one hand, the correct political line is demanded of the poet. On the other, one is justified in expecting his work to have quality. Such a formulation is, of course, unsatisfactory as long as the connection between the two factors, political line and quality, has not been perceived. Of course, the connection can be asserted dogmatically. You can declare, a work that shows the correct political tendency need show no other quality. You can also declare, a work that exhibits the correct tendency must of necessity have every other quality. The second formulation is not uninteresting, and moreover, it is correct. I adopt it as my own. But in so doing, I abstain from asserting it dogmatically. It must be proved. And it is in order to attempt to prove it that I now claim your attention. This is, you will perhaps object, a very specialized, out-of-the-way theme, and do I intend to promote the study of fascism with such a proof? This is indeed my intention. For I hope to be able to show you that the concept of political tendency, in the summary form in which it usually occurs in the debate just mentioned, is a perfectly useless instrument of political literary criticism. So you can't do political literary criticism just by evaluating the political tendency of the producer, of the writer. I would like to show you how the tendency of a literary work can be politically correct, only if it is also literarily correct. That is to say, the politically correct tendency includes a literary tendency. And I would add straight away, this literary tendency, which is implicitly or explicitly contained in every correct political tendency of a work, alone constitutes the quality of that work. The correct political tendency of a work thus includes its literary quality because it includes its literary tendency. So what does he mean by that? So we'll see. Progressive versus reactionary. So progressive for him just means socialism. Reactionary means keeping society capitalist. This assertion, I hope I can promise you, will soon become clearer. For the moment, I would like to interject that I might have chosen a different starting point for my reflections. I started from the unfruitful debate on the relationship between tendency and quality in literature. I could have started from an even older and no less unfruitful debate. What is the relationship between form and content, particularly in political poetry? This kind of question has a bad name, and rightly so. It is the textbook example of the attempt to explain literary connections undialectically, with cliches. Very well, but what then is the dialectical approach to the same question? Meaning, perhaps form and content are in contradiction. Perhaps literary quality and political tendency are in contradiction. We have to deal with that, he says. The dialectical approach to this question, and here I come to the heart of the matter, has absolutely no use for such rigid, isolated things as work, novel, book. It has to insert them into the living social contexts. You rightly declare that this has been done time and again among our friends. Certainly. Only they have often done it by launching at once into large and therefore necessarily often vague questions. Social conditions are, as we know, determined by the conditions of production. And when a work was subjected to a materialist critique, it was customary to ask how this work stood vis-a-vis the social relations of production of its time. This is an important question, but also a very difficult one. Its answer is not always unambiguous. In fact, it's usually self-contradictory. And I would like now to propose to you a more immediate question, a question that is somewhat more modest, somewhat less far-reaching, but that has, it seems to me, more chance of receiving an answer. Instead of asking, what is the attitude of a work to the relations of production of its time? Does it accept them? Is it reactionary? Or does it aim at overthrowing them? Is it revolutionary? Instead of this question, or at any rate before it, I would like to propose another. Rather than asking what is the attitude of a work to the relations of production of its time, I would like to ask, what is its position in them? This question directly concerns the function the work has within the literary relations of production of its time. It is concerned, in other words, directly with the literary technique of works. In bringing up technique, I have named the concept that makes literary products accessible to an immediately social and therefore materialist analysis. At the same time, the concept of technique provides the dialectical starting point from which the unfruitful antithesis of form and content can be surpassed. And furthermore, this concept of technique contains an indication of the correct determination of the relation between tendency and quality, the question raised at the outset. If therefore we stated earlier that the correct political tendency of a work includes its literary quality, because it includes its literary tendency, we can now formulate this more precisely by saying that this literary tendency can consist either in progress or in regression of literary or artistic technique. Okay. So he has a formulation later in the essay that I want to interject here, which is, he says, the writer who doesn't teach other writers teaches no one. The writer who doesn't teach other writers teaches no one. Of course, he's saying that at that two-level analysis, meaning if a writer or an artist is trying to be politically didactic and is trying to teach the readers or the viewers something politically, just doing sort of propaganda, then in fact they might not be teaching them anything at all. So a desideratum of bourgeois art art that had emancipated itself from its ritual context in traditional civilization. Every work of art is a little education in art. Every poem teaches you how to read poetry. Every novel teaches you how to read fiction. Every piece of music teaches you how to listen to music. Every painting teaches you how to look at painting. That's part of the point. So it goes beyond, we've talked about this, beyond entertainment and beyond propaganda. What is that beyond? Beyond means it also has to have value as art, and its primary value as art is to teach people about art. To teach people about how the form works, how the technique works, to make people aware of their aesthetic experience. So again, the Susan Buck-Morse. The work of artists is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. The work of critics is to recognize how they're doing that. So to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience, to make people aware of, and perhaps even more importantly in this context, critically aware of their own experience, their own aesthetic experience. So, art teaches us about the world, it teaches us about society, it teaches us about ourselves. How does it do so? By teaching us about our aesthetic experience of the world, including our aesthetic experience of art itself. So art, in the bourgeois ethos, the humanistic bourgeois ethos of the Renaissance up to the present, everyone is potentially an artist. Not everyone has equal talent to be an artist, but everyone is addressed by literature or by visual art or by music as if they could become an artist or a writer or a musician. Mm-hmm. Right. Why call it a tendency? It's you're taking the side of, you're in the service of. The way he puts it is that you're kind of going with a political tendency. So he's assuming that the political tendencies of his time are either socialist or capitalist. It's the 1930s. Right? It looks like the big questions of history are, is the world going to stick in capitalism or is it going to proceed to socialism? Now there is, of course, fascism, which is a peculiar thing, because fascism also has its weird anti-capitalism and its socialistic aspects. But generally, from the perspective that Benjamin has and that his audience has, what really distinguishes fascism is how it maintains capitalism, right? By regimenting people to it. Even though it might claim to be overcoming capitalism or overthrowing capitalism, all that it's doing is overthrowing like the liberal market and replacing it by the state. Right? But it's still capitalism. So now, in terms of like the audience that you're teaching, so the idea is that these leftist writers that he's addressing, leftist artists that he's addressing here, that they've decided that their audience is not the general bourgeois public, but the proletariat, the working class. Like they've decided to dedicate their artistic and literary production to the class struggle. They become fellow travelers of the proletarian socialist revolution. Now again, that's different from today, right? Where we would be political, the political world is not like the class struggle. The political world is which side of capitalist politics are you choosing? Are you choosing the progressive capitalists, or are you choosing the conservative capitalists? Are you choosing the Ukrainian capitalists or the Russian capitalists? Are you choosing the Arab-Palestinian capitalists or the Israeli-Jewish capitalists? Basically, those are the choices on offer. That's it. All right. So it's very different from our notion of political factionalization and tendency. But insofar as it's still political tendency, then it's about who's the public that you're trying to reach. So again, he's saying your work is not going to be good at a literary level. It's not going to have literary quality unless it's able to teach the proletariat how to become writers. And the writer who doesn't teach other writers teaches no one. And again, he's already at the outset said the writer of bourgeois entertainment literature is not faced with this problem. Why? Because they can assume the public and just address it as it is, rather than addressing the public as it might become, as it might change, as it might be transformed. Right. So he brings up in the section just ahead of what I had read the operating writer. This is Tretiakov. So the idea that because he has to address, okay, so if artists, so we know from reading the Trotsky, the Art and Politics in Our Epoch, that bohemianism has too narrow a social base and the masses live their own life. Right. So he brings up Benjamin, the writer or the artist is a bourgeois writer or artist, period. It doesn't matter what class background. What matters is the conditions of production, the social relations of production. That's what matters. So the only art that exists is bourgeois art, bourgeois literature. That's all that exists. So one tempting way that leftist artists and writers have reached for is, okay, well, I'm going to be the saboteur in the enemy camp. I'm going to blow up bourgeois art and bourgeois literature from the inside. And Benjamin says, no, that's not really a good way of thinking about it. It's not about blowing it up, but it is about trying to make it available to the working class. If you recall the Habermas that we read, Modernity and Incomplete Project, in the Habermas versus Lyotard debate, Habermas said, well, look, it looks like the postmodernists have given up on this earlier aspiration, exemplified by people like Benjamin and Brecht, to take art and culture out of the regime of experts, out of the control of the regime of experts, and put it in the hands of the people. But how do you do that? In other words, you have to educate them about art and literature such that they could become participants in its production and not just in its consumption. So in many ways, it's the same desideratum as the bourgeois humanism. Everyone is potentially an artist or a writer. There is an inherent democratization of art and literature that comes with that, because it's no longer a guildcraft activity the way it was in traditional civilization. In traditional civilization, the divine forces of fate or the gods or God decided who was an artist and who was a writer. And that can be recognized by either the church authorities or by the guildcraft artisans who could recognize a fellow spirit, someone who has been favored to be able to be a painter or a musician or a writer, and taken in hand in the guild. Now, we still have a little bit of residual phenomena of that, meaning academia is a little bit guildy. It's a little guildcrafty, right? So art school, here we are, right? You're joining the guild. If only you were being trained as thoroughly as guild apprentices were trained back in the day. If only that were the case, right? No, not quite. But it is still a guild, right? The credential, right? There is an academic community in which art schools are recognized as art schools, meaning are you a legit artist? Did you get a credential from an art school? You're joining the guild. Right? That's narrow. It's narrow. That's not the masses. No way. It's still a guildcraft. The guild is controlling who gets admitted to the guild. Right? Now, that does cut against the bourgeois ethos of humanism, which is, well, wait, people outside the guild can also be writers and artists, can't they? Huh. So it is interesting that we've reverted back to guildcraft. I only raise that because, is it a meritocracy? Or is it kind of an arbitrary accident and an institutional prerogative? Who gets admitted and who doesn't? Meaning it's not like we have a social mechanism for finding the actually talented writers and visual artists and bringing them into the guild. Actually, the old guilds were probably better at that than we are now with our institutions. Right, so we have this kind of spurious democratic open institution and also like marketplace kind of access to institutional life. Right, but it's like a spuriously democratic mechanism. Right, we give financial aid to poor people to let them join the guild. Yes? How well does that work? I say all this because obviously the political project of Benjamin and his audience was an actual democratization of society, including art and culture. I mean, that is the socialist vision or the communist vision. So again, politicizing aesthetics, politicizing art, in the work of art essay term, is to democratize it. Fascism does not do that. Fascism retains a kind of hierarchy. It only allows the masses to express themselves through an aestheticized politics, but still through a regime of experts that is producing the art of the fascist regime, right? That the masses can kind of glom onto as if it's their expression. It's not actually allowing them their right, which is, if you know this expression, seize the means of production. Seize the means of production. It includes seizing the means of production in art and literature too. But the only thing that we've done since the 60s is celebrate outside our art. We're just like, oh, people are making art outside the guild, that's so great. But then it becomes a kind of ethnographic, anthropological thing. It becomes a kind of curio. I was watching, by the way, so I was watching a negotiator for the Palestinians who used to work for the PLO, but now is sort of sidelined because the Palestinian Authority is kind of sidelined and, Hamas is sort of in charge or whatever. And, he's kind of maybe a little bit older than me. So, but he was at the Oslo stuff as a young person. He was like a kind of a young kind of participant in the negotiating process. And I saw him being interviewed, and he had like a Basquiat shirt on, and I was just like it was fine. It's fine. But it's a problem, We have our sainted outsider artists who we turn into our mascots culturally, like Basquiat, But is that democratization of art? And it's via Andy Warhol. Is Andy Warhol the democratization of art? Because of the Campbell soup cans? Anyway, we'll be talking about that later. It isn't. Still the regime of experts. All right, let me look at the notes that you guys put on this piece on the art author as producer. Okay. Is Una not here? Okay, let's see. All right, here's some questions. Is it possible to move the people to action for the revolutionary struggle through thinking rather than through filling them with feelings? If the spirit that holds forth in the name of fascism was successful in inciting the masses, isn't the revolution Also, doesn't the revolution also need to have powerful emotions? Is thinking a powerful enough force to replace emotion? Good question. Mm-hmm. Yeah, psychologically, thinking something can take the place of acting on it, definitely. Now, at the level of feeling, okay, so surely art is about, and literature are about aesthetics. And so therefore it is the realm of feeling, for sure. How we feel about things, how we experience things at an aesthetic level, meaning how we feel about them. So surely that's the case. Now, of course, there are no thoughts without feelings, nor are there feelings without thoughts. However, there are feelings that can't be formulated logically as thoughts. Right? So, nonetheless, right? We're faced with this kind of paradox. Again, I'll make reference to the Susan Buckmorse from the first week. She said, we need theories that show and don't only argue. Now, Benjamin tries to do this through his presentation, and he called it constellation. I think that we talked about this when we looked at on the mimetic faculty, and also the experience in poverty. So I said that there are two ideas from Benjamin, constellation and construction. So constellation allows us to associate things or establish correspondences between things that aren't necessarily about a kind of logical argumentation. It's not like a logic of cause and effect, but we can look at the correspondence of things without having to decide what causes what comes before what. So the question is, can we think in a non-logical way that nonetheless is meaningful, that nonetheless is rational? Because I think that thinking is not, just narrowly defined here by someone like Benjamin. It's not that the fascists incited people without their thinking. We could say maybe without their critical thinking. Maybe we could put it that way. No, people have to be mobilized at the level of feeling, and art and literature are about making people feel things. Not just, they're not just making logical arguments. They're not just making arguments. They're presenting things. And again, he sets up early on in the essay the idea that there might be a contradiction between tendency and quality, or between form and content. And that contradiction would also be felt. It wouldn't only be thought, it would be felt. Right, so giving form to a contradictory reality, giving form to that aesthetically. All right, so using these kind of terms, using this terminology, using this kind of logical argumentation about contradiction of capitalism, well, yes. However, what is that at an aesthetic level? What is that at an experiential level? How do we describe that? And really, how do we present that more at the level of feeling? He uses imagery. He uses constellations of ideas. He writes aphoristically. He and Adorno, also Krakauer, they did use imagery. at least descriptively. Like they wrote, so they weren't using visual imagery all the time, hardly at all. Although they did try that too. But they played with our imagination and not only with logic to present the issue, to make us recognize it. So recall again from Buckmore's. If the artist's work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience, the work of the critic is to recognize it, meaning to make that recognition possible. And that means also recognizing by way of feeling. Right, like he looked at the rhetoric he used in the epilogue to the work of art essay. That's definitely supposed to make us feel things, and it's supposed to make us feel contradiction. Like quoting Marinetti, the beauty of machine gun fire. Like what? It's like. By the way, the dreamt of metallization of the body. So if you guys know your Marinetti at all, so he's the instigator of futurism. So he writes the Futurist Manifesto, and he has a little autobiographical thing there where he describes when he became a futurist. So when he became a futurist was when he got into a car crash and was thrown from the car into a ditch of water because the car burst into flames, and then he rose out of the water and he was like futurist. Right, and then he had the dream of the metallized body, of course, because he was a trauma victim. And of course, after you're in a fiery car crash, you wish that you had a metal body. Otherwise, you don't kind of want to get into a car ever again, right? Or you could say, cars are awesome, and they're awesome because they're metal, and we should be more like cars. Right, so it's like a kind of subordination of the human to the technological, because the power of technology is such that it makes us wish that we were cyborgs. Right, I guess the tech bros want to upload their consciousness into AI and machines, right? Because somehow machines are more permanent than biological organisms. I guess they are. I don't know. I guess human bodies are less durable than computers. Not really. Computers burn out pretty fast. But at least, there's this dream. There's this dream that if only we become the machine, then our problems will be solved. Nightmarish. But anyway, and it is kind of fascistic, right? So there is this kind of inherent tendency in capitalism to produce this kind of consciousness. I want to live forever because I can't stand the fact that I've wasted my life because of the way capitalism chews us up and spits us out. So I want to live forever, and how will I do that? By transforming my consciousness into part of the artificial intelligence singularity. Nah. And how will we do that? We'll force people via the state to make that happen. I mean, maybe they're not as bad as that, but they are kind of seeming to be going there. Right. But again, the role of the critic would be to present that in the way that we would feel the contradiction. Then the last line you have here quoted, "The spirit that holds forth in the name of fascism must disappear. The spirit that, in opposing it, trusts in its own miraculous powers will disappear. For the revolutionary struggle is not between capitalism and spirit, it is between capitalism and the proletariat." Now, of course, the struggle between capitalism and the proletariat, it means it's an internal struggle. It's a struggle because the proletariat is capitalism. It's the pure product of capitalism. It is what reproduces capitalism. So it's about the self-overcoming of the proletariat, which would be the self-overcoming of capitalism. It would be the self-overcoming of that alienation. Rather than capitalism and spirit, right? So it's easy to say, oh, capitalism is dehumanizing, and it's violating our freedom, it's violating our humanity, right? Those are all the ways that we might describe it, but guess what? The right also describes it that way. The right will tell you that capitalism violates our humanity, violates our spirit. Tucker Carlson will tell us this. The right will tell us this. The fascists told us this. Right? That's not going to do it. That's not going to do it. But then we actually have to find that self-contradiction between capitalism and the proletariat. And that's where he says it's at the level of production. And therefore, at the level of aesthetic form, technique. Now, along the way in The Author as Producer, he also addresses, again, something that he had addressed in the Experience in Poverty essay, namely the Neue Sachlichkeit, the new objectivity, the Bauhaus aesthetic, which he thinks is exemplified by photography. So he criticizes photography because he says photography's message, what photography communicates, is that the world is beautiful. Meaning, if you photograph something, you instantly aestheticize it in such a way that, again, masks the contradiction between form and content, or between technique and historical conditions. And he says, this goes so far that even the photography of poverty makes poverty beautiful. And he says, even the struggle against poverty, when photographed, turns it into an aestheticized object. Now, if we keep in mind what he was saying in the Work of Art essay, photography is fascist because it aestheticizes the world and allows the world to express itself without changing it. So this is his beef with the Neue Sachlichkeit, the new matter-of-factness, the new objectivity, and the Bauhaus aesthetic. The Bauhaus aesthetic, which, was not self-consciously fascist by any means. It was kind of liberal democratic. It was egalitarian. It was about producing consumer goods for the masses that were functional, useful, good for them, cheap, affordable, right? Useful. And yet, what it really did was maintain capitalism, kept things exactly as they are. So it democratized consumption in such a way that preserved capitalism. It turns out that there are affinities between the fascist aesthetics and the liberal democratic aesthetics, the Bauhaus aesthetics. There were. The point of contact is that it leaves the world as it is, meaning it adjusts our made world into something useful to people, but only insofar as they remain in capitalism. Right? Again, in such a way that we completely have naturalized it. Right? So we're surrounded by the Bauhaus aesthetic. We're fully immersed in the Neue Sachlichkeit aesthetic. We're completely suffused by photography, by photographic imagery, and by IKEA furniture and functionalist aesthetics. And it's egalitarian, it's liberal, it's enlightened, right, in comparison to the styles of the 19th century, which still seem strangely bourgeois and old-fashioned and kind of musty and maybe even hierarchical. Right, so we've democratized capitalism, but without overcoming it. Fascism's part of that. Fascism is a democratic movement. Now, I mentioned photography because this goes for cinema as well, meaning kitsch. Photography and cinema are the models of kitsch. They're the models for kitsch. They're the models for the fascist aesthetics, meaning the aestheticization of reality while keeping it the same. So given that, what do we do about it? Because this is where we get into the work of art in the age of its technical or technological reproducibility, or in the age of mechanical reproduction. Meaning, okay, we live in fascist aesthetics, no doubt, we do. Popular culture, everything. Music, visual culture, photography, film. It is. Is that the end of the story? No. Why is it not the end of the story? Because it remains self-contradictory. It remains self-contradictory. Meaning, it points beyond itself. Meaning, it's still in crisis. It's not resolved. It might paper over the contradiction in the crisis, but it doesn't actually resolve it. It sustains it in its own way. So then the question is how? How does it do so in such a way that we can see how it points beyond itself? How does it do so in such a way where one can write something about it, like Benjamin, and make us feel the contradiction of it? Right, because that's what he's trying to do. I mean, these essays that we've been reading, again, we started with the Krakauer, with the mouse ornament and the photography essay. They are meant to do something. They are meant to achieve something. This kind of critical writing is meant to accomplish something. And what is it meant to accomplish? It's meant to recognize, have a critical recognition, and part of that is feeling it. Right, so for some reason this year I came across this formulation for myself because I engaged in some popular political writing that turned out to be kind of treacherous to do. But anyway, I did it, and I did my own crazy version of it and all that. And I realized that, okay, dialectics, and we can't really do dialectics exactly the same way as before, but maybe we could do cognitive dissonance. So I was like, okay, maybe I can do cognitive dissonance as a kind of ersatz dialectics. So if it helps us to think about what Benjamin and Adorno and Krakauer were trying to do, they're not just logically presenting contradiction, they are trying to get the reader to experience cognitive dissonance. Again, to experience contradiction. And again, a term that we have now that they didn't have then is cognitive dissonance, which I'm misapplying this term, of course, slightly because it's like a clinical term, but nonetheless it does capture something of how we're supposed to feel and how we feel it. Like, in other words, how we bring that feeling about. Okay, so let's see what Benjamin says here. In principle, a work of art has always been reproducible. So in principle, a work of art has always been reproducible. So what's meant by reproduction is tricky. What's meant by reproduction is not necessarily straightforward. It's not just original and copy. It's not as simple as that. So he says man-made artifacts could always be imitated by men. Replicas were made by pupils in practice of their craft, by masters for diffusing their works, and finally by third parties in the pursuit of gain. Mechanical reproduction, or technological would be another translation of a work of art, however, represents something new. New, but also something that has a history. Historically, it advanced intermittently and in leaps at long intervals, but with accelerated intensity. The Greeks knew only two procedures of technically reproducing works of art, founding and stamping. Bronzes, terracottas, and coins were the only artworks which they could produce in quantity. Also the Chinese, the terracotta army. Now, the reason I say this is that, the Industrial Revolution is what defines capitalism for Marxists like Benjamin. However, both the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production have longer histories than just the modern era. So in some ways, bourgeois social relations go all the way back. In other words, the social relations of labor have ancient roots. the industrial forces of production also have ancient roots. What's unique about capitalism and what's new is the contradiction between the two. Okay, all other artworks were unique and could not be mechanically reproduced. With the woodcut, so the jumping ahead, jumping from ancient Greece and classical antiquity in various civilizations, all the way up to the woodcut, and again the woodcut cross-culturally. With the woodcut, graphic art became mechanically reproducible for the first time, long before script became reproducible by print, so the woodcut predates the printing press. The enormous changes which printing, the mechanical reproduction of writing, has brought about in literature are a familiar story. However, within the phenomenon which we are here examining from the perspective of world history, print is merely a special, though particularly important case. During the Middle Ages, engraving and etching were added to the woodcut. At the beginning of the 19th century, lithography made its appearance. With lithography, the technique of reproduction reached an essentially new stage. So this is the Industrial Revolution. This much more direct process was distinguished by the tracing of the design on a stone rather than its incision on a block of wood or its etching on a copper plate, and permitted graphic art for the first time to put its products on the market, not only in large numbers as hitherto, but also in daily changing forms. So because you could always redo the stone engraving. Lithography enabled graphic art to illustrate everyday life, and it began to keep pace with printing. So the illustrated newspaper, the daily illustrated newspaper. But only a few decades after its invention, lithography was surpassed by photography. For the first time in the process of pictorial reproduction, photography freed the hand of the most important artistic functions, which henceforth devolved only upon the eye looking into a lens. Since the eye perceives more swiftly than the hand can draw, the process of pictorial reproduction was accelerated so enormously that it could keep pace with speech. A film operator shooting a scene in the studio captures the images at the speed of an actor's speech. Just as lithography virtually implied the illustrated newspaper, so did photography foreshadow the sound film. If you recall from the Adorno curves of the needle in form of the phonographic record, Adorno treated sound recording as the photography of sound. The technical reproduction of sound was tackled at the end of the last century. These convergent endeavors made predictable a situation which Paul Valéry pointed up in his sentence: just as water, gas, and electricity are brought into our houses from far off to satisfy our needs in response to a minimal effort, so we shall be supplied with visual or auditory images which will appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand, hardly more than a sign. So this was all predictable from 1900. Like all we've done is perfect that. Around 1900, technical reproduction had reached a standard that not only permitted it to reproduce all transmitted works of art, and thus to cause the most profound change in their impact on the public, it had also captured a place of its own among the artistic processes. For the study of this standard, nothing is more revealing than the nature of the repercussions of these two different manifestations, the reproduction of works of art and the art of the film, have had on art in its traditional form. Okay. He brings us around then to the aura, which we've encountered previously in the Little History of Photography. Now I want to say something. Why is it significant that we can have an art of technological reproduction that can keep pace with speech and keep pace with daily life processes? Well, because society is changing all the time. In other words, why do we need to be able to do this at such a fast pace? Because in fact, reality changes more quickly than the old art forms can keep pace with. So he writes, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element, its presence in space and time, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. This unique existence of the work of art determined the history to which it was subject throughout the time of its existence. This includes the changes which it may have suffered in physical condition over the years, as well as the various changes in its ownership. The traces of the first can be revealed by chemical or physical analyses, which is impossible to perform on a reproduction, and changes of ownership are subject to a tradition which must be traced from the situation of the original. The presence of the original is the prerequisite to the concept of authenticity. Chemical analyses of the patina of a bronze can help establish this, as does the proof that a given manuscript of the Middle Ages stems from an archive of the 15th century. So now we can do radioactive isotope analyses to determine the dates of things. The whole sphere of authenticity is outside technical, and of course not only technical, reproducibility. Confronted with its manual reproduction, which was usually branded as a forgery, the original preserved all its authority. Not so vis-a-vis technical reproduction. The reason is twofold. First, process reproduction is more independent of the original than manual reproduction. For example, in photography, process reproduction can bring out those aspects of the original that are unattainable to the naked eye, yet accessible to the lens, which is adjustable and chooses its angle at will. And photographic reproduction, with the aid of certain processes, such as enlargement or slow motion, can capture images which escape natural vision. So in the Little History of Photography, he addressed this as the optical unconscious, the fact that the photograph gives us more than we intend to depict. So the photographic image provides more than we intend to depict in a way that's different from at least the way painting was done traditionally. So painting makes us see more than is physically present in the image, However, it's still intended by the artist. Whereas Krakauer said photography gives us all this noise and garbage, and Benjamin interpreted that as the optical unconscious. Why did he use a psychoanalytic term like the optical unconscious? Because what it meant is that it's something that could become conscious. In other words, it's in the photograph and then we can notice it later. In the Krakauer essay that we read, it was the changing character of the photograph of the grandmother. So it was a studio portrait, but then it becomes an archaeological exhibit of fashion from 60 years earlier. All right, so what becomes important is literally the garb, that's her clothes, right? Which take on a greater historical significance than would have been understood when the photograph was originally taken. Secondly, he says, technical reproduction can put the copy of the original into situations which would be out of reach for the original itself. Above all, it enables the original to meet the beholder halfway, be it in the form of a photograph or of a phonograph record. The cathedral leaves its locale to be perceived in the studio of a lover of art. The choral reproduction, performed in an auditorium or in the open air, resounds in the drawing room. The situations into which the product of mechanical reproduction can be brought may not touch the actual work of art, yet the quality of its presence is always depreciated. Right, because physical presence in space and time is no longer required to have the experience. Now, what he's saying here, again, photography produces more, art produces more, but photography produces more in a particular way. Photography is art. And also it lets us see things that we wouldn't otherwise see. So the technology exceeds our subjectivity, our biological perception, to be sure, but also our visual imagination. So the presence is depreciated. This holds not only for the artwork, but also, for instance, for a landscape, which passes in review before the spectator in a movie. In the case of the art object, a most sensitive nucleus, namely its authenticity, is interfered with, whereas no natural object is vulnerable on that score. The authenticity of a thing is the essence of all that is transmissible from its beginning, ranging from the substantive duration to its testimony to the history which it has experienced. Since the historical testimony rests on the authenticity, the former, too, is jeopardized by reproduction when substantive duration ceases to matter. And what is really jeopardized when the historical testimony is affected is the authority of the object. One might subsume the eliminated element in the term aura and go on to say that which withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the aura of the work of art. This is a symptomatic process whose significance points beyond the realm of art. One might generalize by saying the technique of reproduction detaches the reproduced object from the domain of tradition. By making many reproductions, it substitutes a plurality of copies for a unique existence. And in permitting the reproduction to meet the beholder or listener in his own particular situation, it reactivates the object reproduced. These two processes lead to a tremendous shattering of tradition, which is the obverse of the contemporary crisis and renewal of mankind. Both processes are intimately connected with the contemporary mass movements. Their most powerful agent is the film. Its social significance, particularly in the most positive form, is inconceivable without its destructive, cathartic aspect, that is, the liquidation of the traditional value of the cultural heritage. This phenomenon is most palpable in the great historical films. It extends to ever new positions. In 1927, Abel Gance exclaimed enthusiastically, "Shakespeare, Rembrandt, Beethoven will make films. All legends, all mythologies, and all myths, all founders of religion and the very religions await their exposed resurrection, and the heroes crowd each other at the gate." Presumably without intending to, he issued an invitation to a far-reaching liquidation. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to the aura. The concept of aura, which was proposed above with reference to historical objects, may usefully be illustrated with reference to the aura of natural ones. We define the aura of the latter as the unique phenomenon of a distance, however close it may be. If while resting on a summer afternoon, you follow with your eyes a mountain range on the horizon or a branch which casts its shadow over you, you experience the aura of those mountains of that branch. This image makes it easy to comprehend the social bases of the contemporary decay of the aura. It rests on two circumstances, both of which are related to the increasing significance of the masses in contemporary life, namely the desire of contemporary masses to bring things closer spatially and humanly, which is just as ardent as their bent towards overcoming the uniqueness of every reality by accepting its reproduction. Every day, the urge grows stronger to get hold of an object at very close range by way of its likeness, its reproduction. Unmistakably, reproduction as offered by picture magazines and newsreels differs from the image seen by the unarmed eye. Uniqueness and permanence are as closely linked to the latter as are transitoriness and reproducibility in the former. To pry an object from its shell, to destroy its aura, is the mark of a perception whose sense of the universal equality of things has increased to such a degree that it extracts it even from a unique object by means of reproduction. Thus is manifested in the field of perception what in the theoretical sphere is noticeable in the increasing importance of statistics. The adjustment of reality to the masses and of the masses to reality is a process of unlimited scope, as much for thinking as for perception. Okay. So let me just review with you guys what we talked about in terms of aura. So it's presence, it's the appearance. but we're really concerned with the destruction or decay or the disintegration of the aura or the presence. Presence in space and time. And both in terms of nearness or proximity and distance. So when something is present, its presence is both a relation of proximity and distance, nearness and distance. And nearness and distance in both space and in time. So we also encountered a new illustrator from our or is the strange weave of space and time that constitutes presence. All right. But we're concerned with, again, the destruction, decay, and disintegration of this. Of the order. So he says the uniqueness of a work of art is inseparable from its being embedded in the fabric of a tradition. So in a traditional situation, space and time are established. The relation is established. So experience is embedded within a traditional weave of space and time, not the strange weave. Strange weave is like the capitalist condition. This tradition itself is thoroughly alive and extremely changeable. An ancient statue of Venus, for example, stood in a different traditional context with the Greeks, who made it an object of veneration, than with the clerics of the Middle Ages, who viewed it as an ominous idol. Both of them, however, were equally confronted with its uniqueness, that is, its aura. Originally, the contextual integration of art in tradition found its expression in the cult. We know that the earliest artworks originated in the service of a ritual, first the magical, then the religious kind. It is significant that the existence of the work of art with reference to its aura is never entirely separated from its ritual function. So again, this is the cult value. In other words, the unique value of the authentic work of art has its basis in ritual, the location of its original use value. This ritualistic basis, however remote, is still recognizable as secularized ritual, even in the most profane forms of the cult of beauty. So art and literature have now taken on their own ritual or cult value in bourgeois society. They've kind of reverted, especially in capitalism, they've become a cult of their own. So rather than being embedded in the cult of religion or in the cult of political power, so either with the priestly caste or with the warrior caste, the aristocracy and the nobility, or for that matter, in the ritual of the commoners, right? The sacred character of the everyday practices of the common people, not just the ruling castes. Right. So secularization has profaned this ritual value. The secular cult of beauty developed during the Renaissance and prevailing for 3 centuries clearly showed that ritualistic basis is in its decline and the first deep crisis which befell it. With the advent of the first truly revolutionary means of production, photography, simultaneously with the rise of socialism, art sensed the approaching crisis which has become evident a century later. At the time, art reacted with the doctrine of art for art's sake, l'art pour l'art, that is, with a theology of art. This gave rise to what might be called a negative theology in the form of the idea of pure art, which not only denied any social function of art, but also any categorizing by subject matter. In poetry, Mallarmé was the first to take this position. An analysis of art in the age of mechanical reproduction must do justice to these relationships, for they lead us to an all-important insight. For the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. To an ever greater degree, the work of art reproduced becomes the work of art designed for reproducibility. From a photographic negative, for example, one can make any number of prints. To ask for an authentic print makes no sense. But the instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production, the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, politics. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, because he's going to bring in the class struggle. But let's back up a second. So he brings up the statue of Venus and the changed significance that it had for either the Greeks or the Middle Ages priests, or the Church of the Middle Ages. In either case, it has a kind of ritual, cult, sacred value, even if the priests of the Middle Ages saw it as a demonic or satanic thing. It still had a kind of theological character to it. Right, so, but let's take this cult value and ritual value to another extent. So he brings up the icon in the church, like the portrait of a saint. So this is something that we talked about a little bit with the Daniel Sherman essay on art in the age of capitalism, in the age of the museum. So the art looted from Italy by Napoleon, brought back to the Louvre. And the question of what is happening to the experience of art such that this is possible. So that even if you left the artwork where it was in the church in Italy, it would just turn Italy itself into a giant museum that people would go to in order to look at these religious works as art. So this is the exhibition value. This is the exhibition value, which he thinks starts with the Renaissance and then develops and really intensifies to the point of a crisis with photography. Right, so exhibition value versus cult value, or exhibition value versus ritual value. Now, bourgeois art itself, which was based on emancipating art from its cult value and establishing its exhibition value, that bourgeois art itself, that's supposed to be based on exhibition value, becomes instead based on a new cult value. And the new cult value is the cult of art itself. Right, so that is when bourgeois society, bourgeois humanism, bourgeois social relations themselves take the place of tradition. They take the place of the authority of tradition. However, under attack from the crisis of capitalism. So capitalism is undermining that sacrality of bourgeois society and its categories, including art. Right, so that sacrality of humanity, of humanism, humanistic values, and the bourgeois values of art, that goes into crisis in the Industrial Revolution. Photography is a symptom of that. So one major point I want to emphasize is that it's not that photography changed art. Photography is the expression of a changing subjectivity. So it's expressed in photography, but photography is not itself doing it. The reason that we think that photography does things is that we think that technology does things. Technology doesn't do anything. Technology just expresses something that we are doing. So photography isn't just a new kind of way of depicting things that is technologically innovative. It's a crisis of our perception of things. It's a crisis of our subjectivity. Photography is a symptom of that. And film, an even more intensified symptom of that. The other symptom of it, the obverse side, is, again, treating bourgeois art, which was meant to be secularized and emancipated and enlightening and humanistic. It's supposed to be about learning about art. Itself now becomes this kind of locus of ritual mystery. So in the 19th century, modernism and photography coexist historically, emerge at the same time historically. It's not that photography caused painting to become modernist. It's that the same social process affects both. It affects painting and it causes the invention of photography. So both the new formal techniques of painting in modernism that Greenberg was talking about, the medium reflexivity intensifies in painting with the question of its purpose and what it can do. And artists from there on explore more radically what the capacities of the medium itself are. That happens at the same time that photography is invented. So they're both expressions of a crisis of this bourgeois subjectivity. So painting goes into a kind of radical crisis or a crisis of radicalization that wouldn't have made any sense for the 3 centuries preceding, going back to the Renaissance. Right, the abstract art, the abstract aspect of painting, being brought out would not have made sense to anyone before that time, before the industrial era. But also photography wouldn't have made sense to people before the industrial era. Nobody wanted photography. They could have had it. They could have had photography. They didn't want it. We wanted it. Why? Because we needed to give form. We needed to be able to represent to ourselves the crisis, the destruction, the decay, disintegration of presence. Physical presence, visual presence, representability of our experience in space and time. Right, so cult value changed its function, exhibition value changed its function. So exhibition value was first about this bourgeois emancipation of art. Now it's about the crisis of art and capitalism. Let's take a short break. I don't want to get too marathonic with you guys. And then we'll go back to your notes and look at what you guys wanted to raise about the work of art essay. Okay, 5 or 10 minutes. All right, let's resume. Longy?
One of my questions is actually about like how this later forms of art, or movement of art relates to this discussion of art, for example, conceptual art. And also, another problem was raised in the letter to Benjamin from Adorno about, like he contends about that you don't think the autonomy of art is like fully identical to this aura mystical thing. And he suggests that Benjamin needs like a little bit more dialectics in his essay. Yeah, that's like my basic.
Okay. That's right. So Adorno said that, right, the autonomous work of art in capitalism still has this critical function. It still has the exhibition value. It hasn't become merely cult value. Now, Benjamin's argument in the essay is pretty complicated. So it's complex. It's not that he just lines things up. The autonomous work of art is reactionary and on the side of the bourgeoisie, whereas the destruction of aura is revolutionary or progressive and on the side of the proletariat. Yeah. I don't think that Benjamin really does say that in the essay. However, it is liable to be taken that way, and that is usually the way it's read, in fact. So it is a problem. Now, okay, so two questions were raised. So one by you, Long Yu, and the other by Yuna, which is, how to think about the original and the reproduction in the case of either 3D printed, 3D movies, right, that are digital, like CGI, or in the case of conceptual art. So let's back up a second and think about how he analogizes. So he has a sort of two analogies that he sets up with photography and film. Right, so he says that a painter is more like a faith healer, where there's like a laying on of hands, whereas the photographer is more like a surgeon, where it penetrates the body. That's one way that he tries to illustrate this. And he also says that it can be illustrated by way of the difference between a film actor and a stage actor. So a stage actor is playing for people and therefore adjusting their performance to the people who are present with them. So not only is the actor present with the audience, but the audience is present with the actor. Whereas the film actor is acting for the camera, and so is reacting to the camera in the same way that the film audience is reacting not to the actor, but to the image of the actor projected on the screen. All right, so what he's emphasizing in either case is the mediation. So the mediation of the stage drama is different from the mediation of the cinematic experience of film. Now with photography and the faith healer, right, the surgeon and the faith healer, photography and painting, it has to do with distance and nearness. So a faith healer is in some ways closer to the person than a surgeon is. A surgeon is kind of got to keep a sort of mental, emotional distance from the patient, but physically violates that distance, right? So a faith healer doesn't penetrate the body, so keeps a physical distance, but is in some ways closer to the actual person. Whereas the surgeon is more distant from the person, but closer to the body. Indeed, violates the boundaries of the body. Okay, so again, these are some funny kind of imagery. And it is supposed to make us feel like the alienation of surgery and the alienation of film acting, and even the experience of watching a film with respect to the actors. Here's a category that he uses: distraction. So distraction is this funny category. Again, we could easily lose the plot. We could easily mistake what he's talking about here. It's not that you have a kind of rapt attention when looking at a painting versus being distracted while watching a film. Actually, in some ways, it's the reverse. Meaning that a film is a kind of all-absorbing experience. Right, so distraction is not about the object. It's actually about the subject. Meaning, when Michael Fried, in the reading from last week, and we'll come back to this in a few weeks, we'll read Art and Objecthood by Michael Fried, he will use these categories again, absorption and theatricality. So theatricality, the conventionality of an artwork, meeting the expectations, the cultural conventions of the artwork. So just, okay, I went to see a play. I went to see a film. Right? I am reading a novel. I am looking at a painting. So if it just is conventional, then it's theatrical. It's absorbing when it goes beyond meeting the expectations of the convention. Well, what does going beyond meeting the expectations of the convention mean? It means changing the conventions. It means changing the expectations. It means transcending what we thought a painting was. So an absorbing experience of a painting and having an experience of conviction with the painting, being convinced of the painting, has to do with feeling that this painting is necessary, or this film is necessary, or this novel is necessary, or this poem is necessary, or this piece of music is necessary. That it isn't just a sort of iteration of a cultural practice, but that it itself is necessary. So, necessary in what sense? In the sense that it does something new and different. Okay, so absorption and theatricality, distraction. So, being too absorbed in a film could prevent you from looking at it in terms of its exhibition value, looking at it more critically. So cult value or ritual value and exhibition value which includes of art itself, art becoming culture, this would be the affirmative versus critical values. Right, so part of what Adorno was raising with the letter to Benjamin is that Benjamin was sort of over-attributing a critical value to film and overly ascribing an affirmative value to the more traditional bourgeois art forms, especially because those bourgeois art forms had been radicalized in the modernist era, in the capitalist era. Right, so there is avant-garde painting. And obviously most film is kitsch. So one of the things that Adorno points out is that the critical value that Benjamin is ascribing to film is belied by the Hollywood style, or he brings it into the German context. He says that he went on like a tour, like a kind of tourist kind of visit to the sets of the studios at Neue Babelsberg. That's the German Hollywood. And he said that he was impressed by just how much effort goes into what he called the infantile reproduction of reality, the infantile mimesis of reality, and not the kind of more critical, challenge to our ordinary perception that you see in avant-garde cinema or in like montage effects. That in fact, the kind of the shock value of montage, of editing, and also of like playing with visual scale, and also temporal effects that come with editing, but also just with cinematic filming, was not what was happening in most film at all. It might be happening in like Soviet film, Sergei Eisenstein's film, but it's not happening in Hollywood film. It's not, right? Meaning, the film is allowing you to be distracted from your own subjectivity in a way that painting is making you more aware of your subjectivity. Like looking at the painting makes you aware of how you look at things. Not only how you look at painting, but how you look at things. And that hasn't gone away in painting. Indeed, it's sustained by modernism in painting, by people attempting to do new and different things in painting. Now, coming around to it, like conceptual art. Like, what is conceptual art supposed to do? It is supposed to make us pay attention to, in a very avant-garde way. I think that we talked about this with Courbet and Manet. So Manet calls attention to art by being inferential, by being painting about painting, whereas Courbet, as the first avant-garde painter, calls attention to the situation of painting itself in society, in its context. Right, so it's sort of, it's not just about painting, but it's painting about painting and also about painting in society, painting's relation in society. Right, so that's where the exhibition value would be critical in that respect as well. It wouldn't assume the place of art in society. So when art itself takes on a cult or ritual value, then its social situation, its social context, its social function is assumed. And we don't have a way of dealing with it critically. So distraction is a kind of an interesting thing, because in some ways we could be too absorbed in the experience, and that distracts us not from the object, but it distracts us from ourselves. Right, so that's really the issue, and something like conceptual art is attempting to allow us to notice how we experience things. Meaning, conceptual art has a critical dimension insofar as it problematizes our experience of art and makes us ask the question, like, what is the work in this situation? Is it the idea of it, or is it the execution of it, or what's the relationship between the idea and the execution, and what about our aesthetic experience of it? If that's rendered secondary to the idea of it, what does that do to the aesthetic experience of it? It is an attempt to put it into some kind of critical relation. I mean, conceptual art was avant-garde in that sense.
All conceptual art's purpose to transcend, and it's not as successful if it does not. Essentially, if that's what it is, it's like meant to border on like all the way the entire genre. Does it have to have that all the way?
Well, the issue would be, why did anyone ever make that conceptual turn historically? Like, what does the emergence of conceptual art mean? And wasn't art already conceptual? Why did it have to become so literally conceptual at the moment in history when it did? And then, of course, it's been kitchified in the meantime. Meaning now we can encounter things in the world that are basically conceptual art pieces, and everyone knows, oh, it's art. And they know that it's not art because of its like sensory aesthetical values, but because of that like funny question it puts in your head as you see it. Right? It's like that already has now become art. So that has become theatrical, and to put it in Fried's terms. It's become conventionalized. It's become kitchified. Like, even when it's not like super popular, it's still, insofar as conceptual pieces are in kind of public spaces, the general public, even people who haven't been to art school, kind of recognize it. They're like, okay, what is this? Oh, it must be art. Right? So it's lost its critical edge. It might have had a critical edge in the 60s and 70s. It's kind of become more conventionalized in the meantime. Right, so the thing that just occurred to me was an acquaintance of mine, Glenn Lagan. Do you guys know him? He's an artist. He's a black and also gay painter, and his painting is more like, I don't know what, post-abstract expressionist something. It's like text paintings. Here, let me bring up his stuff. What he's known for. But he's also done other things like exhibition works and like yeah. Have you seen this kind of painting? Yeah. Okay, Glenn Lagan. Okay. Anyway, I went to a museum. Was it the Musée d'Orsay? It must have been the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And they happened to have like a Glenn Lagan piece, but it wasn't like this kind of a piece. It was just a list of Black American artists, like on a pillar. Like it was just sort of, just normal typeface, like regular printing, and it was kind of like you just saw this, and then what the hell is that? And then I like looked at the little plaque, and I was like, oh, Glenn Lagan, and I was like, oh no, this is like not a good Glenn Lagan book, right? But it was like Black American artists who had lived in Paris and worked in Paris or whatever, right? And so it was kind of like, okay, I guess that's art, blah, because it's supposed to make us think about like modernism, because Musée d'Orsay is like the modern art museum, and how like modernism, like Paris modernism, well, it also had Black American participation, and so I don't know what it's supposed to make us think. Didn't make me think very much. I was like, oh no, Glenn, this is sad. I'm sure he was commissioned to do it, right? But it was kind of like, it was like a one-trick pony or a one-note song, like just kind of lacked some dimensionality to it. Anyway, because otherwise I like his stuff. But that one I didn't like too much. Anyway, sorry, Glenn. And also at the same time, I'll tell you guys this, the same visit, I was looking for Manet's Olympia, which we looked at in class. Okay. And it was like not in its usual place. But where was it? It was in like a special exhibit of like depictions of Black people in French art. Because it has the Black woman who's the brothel worker in the painting. And I was like, oh no. So basically it's like, people have lost a total sense of anything. Like they've lost like the whole, what makes artworks important. And so it's like, oh, we don't, Manet, Olympia, blah, blah. Like, we don't know why it's important. Oh, it's important because it depicts a Black woman. That's how it's important. It's like, fuck. So anyway, in some ways things have been reduced to the conceptual in a sort of drastic, kind of problematic way. Because I guess we're supposed to consider how racist or not racist Manet is, and alongside all the other painters' works that they had in this little room exhibit that they had set up. Anyway, it was bad. So that was in 2019. That was the year before COVID. It was 2019. So we could say that the way art has been radicalized in the modern era, in the capitalist era, including things like conceptualism, have been attempts at rescuing the exhibition value from the cult value. Right, and have tried to call attention to our experience of things rather than us being distracted from ourselves in the experience, where we can take ourselves for granted, or we can take our subjectivity for granted, or we can take our experience for granted. Now again, crisis of experience, why and how do we have a problematic experience? Well, of course, Benjamin assumes that in capitalism, the bourgeois subject is in crisis. The bourgeois subject of experience is in crisis. Our experience is problematical. The only question is whether art allows us to recognize that, or whether it suppresses that recognition, whether it sort of actively elides that aspect of our experience. And that would be the kitsch dimension. All right, so kitsch allows us to evade the contradiction. Whereas to try to keep itself alive, art has to try to do things that don't evade that contradiction, but present it. Right, so interestingly, I'll also say about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. So when I was in a very similar class to this one, except at the University of Chicago, namely an incoming graduate student survey in the art history department, a lot of the students thought that the work of art essay was sort of nostalgic for the old art and sort of mourning the loss of that and more critical of photography and cinema. Right, so he can be read undialectically in both ways. He could be read as someone who's just celebrating like art and capitalism, or he can be read melancholically as regretting and mourning the loss of the old art forms. So he can be read undialectically either way, which I thought was interesting. Meaning he could be, it could seem like he's on the side of the magician or the faith healer rather than the surgeon, and therefore on the side of the painter rather than the photographer, or that he'd be on the side of stage acting as opposed to film acting. That is also something that people can mistake the argument for. So he's not on either side of this, but he is trying to present the contradiction therein. So, mastering under a state of distraction. So the state of distraction, it's not like a choice that we have. It's more our condition. Right, so capitalism distracts us from ourselves, and we can either try to confront that, or we can kind of evade it, or sort of revel in it. We can kind of just give ourselves over to it, or we can try to deal with it, address it. So he's trying to, like in the Experience in Poverty essay, find what he calls a positive definition of barbarism. Meaning, okay, there is something barbaric about photography and film, but the question is, does it have a prognostical value? Meaning, what does this change really signify? What does it represent? What does it express? Right, so I want to just emphasize something, which is that ever since the Renaissance, art has been a commodity. It's not that it becomes a commodity only with industrial technique. It was a commodity. The changed character of the commodity is with its mass distribution, which is actually a crisis of it as a commodity. Meaning, taste. So we encountered this term here as an outmoded concept. We also encountered it in The Fetish Character in Music and the Regression of Listening by Adorno, where he said, look, taste doesn't seem to apply, even though people will describe it in those terms as liking or not liking, but really it's really a matter of familiar or unfamiliar. All right, so taste doesn't seem to apply. Judgment, therefore, doesn't seem to apply. So we don't relate to works or even experiences with a faculty of judgment, or at least not simply so, because that very faculty has been rendered problematical or is in crisis. Distraction is his way of describing this. So a public that could judge, a discerning public, a judging public, a public that's able to exercise taste, That's precisely what seems to be missing in capitalism. Now, you'll also notice he brings up here, as he had in the little history of photography, that photography itself has registered this crisis, but in a peculiar way. Meaning, in the same way that Greenberg was talking about medium specificity and a kind of radical self-referentiality of the medium, that also happens with photography. So Eugene Atget tried to get away from the conventionality of photography by photographing empty streets in Paris, right, which seems to negate the preferred use of photography, which is portraiture. Right, and so the way he described it in the little history of photography is that Atget is sort of depleting the aura of reality, sort of evacuating the aura from reality in this way. If you guys know do you know Atget's photography? I don't want to click on something that looks vague. This is empty streets. This is Atget. This is like the modern. This is sort of modern version. This is the Atget version. Right. So it is an attempt to again bring out what he was calling the optical unconscious in photography, meaning rather than paying attention to the people who are depicted, you pay attention to the built environment that is the background. Right. And so something similar as what happened in painting happens in photography, which is the more abstract texture of the image itself is emphasized once the portrait aspect is or eschewed. And then, of course, in Benjamin's own time, I think that we talked about this. I hope that we had time to talk about this with the little history of photography. In the 1920s, avant-garde photography revisits a lot of phenomena of early photography. So they tried things like multiple exposure, long duration exposure, like trying to recapture the daguerreotype effect. But also they did things even more radical, like photography without lenses. If you guys know the rayographs, right? So that's when you just expose film to things, like you put physical objects on the film. Right, it's a cameraless photograph. By Man Ray. That's why it's called the rayograph. So photography without lenses, photography with multiple exposures, multiple lenses also. So stereoscopy comes back. Something that was experimented with early photography, it comes back. But again, it's with the avant-garde. So photography seems to come full circle in the 1920s, in Benjamin's own time. And it's anticipated a bit by Atget, who is the generation before, late 19th century. All right, so again, what do we do with this condition of the permeation of our aesthetic culture by photography and film? You know, to use Clement Greenberg's category of a dominant art form from the newer Laocoon, is the dominant art form of our time photography, visual art form, and more so even film, cinema. Is that our dominant art form, and do all other art forms seek to imitate the effects of that art form? Seemingly, that would be the case. Right. So there is something fundamentally true to our experience in this form, and yet Benjamin wants it to be true to the crisis of our experience, meaning that the form embodies this contradiction, embodies this crisis of our experience. And so rather than treating it as a dead end or a cul-de-sac or like a terminus point, that we will just have photography and film forever. The question is, how do photography and cinema, as we experience them, especially as kitsch objects, as in their kitsch form, do they point beyond themselves? Do they point to visual art, visual culture beyond what we have now in capitalism? And can we see that in these forms themselves? So it would have been indicative to Benjamin that even though there was radical experimentation with photography and film in the Soviet Union, there was a sort of facile, very easy deployment of photography and film by capitalism, by either fascist regimes for propaganda purposes or by liberal democratic capitalism, right? Doesn't seem fussed about photography and cinema, whereas in the early Soviet Union, actually photography and cinema was taken up in radical avant-garde ways. And that's because he thought they detected the fact that they couldn't use these forms unproblematically. They couldn't just adopt their conventional use and just turn it to that political project. At least not until the 1930s, not until Stalinism. Of course, in socialist realism, then you have the Soviet Union just using photography and film the way all other countries do, in the kitsch form. And you have the active suppression of its avant-garde character. In liberal democracy, the suppression of the avant-garde happened more organically, spontaneously, and then it bubbles up again in the 50s and 60s. And then goes away. Meaning it's hardly done now. It's very, very, kind of offbeat now. At least that's my cranky judgment. So I was an avant-garde video artist. I tried, to engage in that genre, and there was a place for it in the public realm, and it got replaced by independent cinema, which just means low-budget kitsch and niche market kitsch. In other words, it became culture again. However market segmented, niche market in character. All right, so next week we go back to the 19th century and we look for the origins of this in the middle of the 19th century with Baudelaire. How is Baudelaire expressing this bourgeois subject in crisis, this crisis of experience, at the same time that it's emerging in things like photography and avant-garde and modernist painting, but long before it takes the form of cinema, but still seems to anticipate it in some ways. All right, I'll see you guys next week.